I'm Norm Ravvin. I'm the next reader in an online literary series that's highlighting the work included by Ruth Panofsky in her new anthology, The New Spice Box, Contemporary Jewish Writing. And Ruth was good enough to include in it a story of mine from a story collection called Glendale, north of Alhambra, east of Burbank. And I'll read it off the original page just to make things familiar to my eye. I went to Glendale because my great-aunt F had died, and I was the only one who could pick up on such short notice, fly down and clean up the mess. Everything had been complicated by the quake, although F was already in hospital when the ground buckled. Her house locked up tight, her 2 cockatoos boarded at a pet store in Burbank. F's house had taken quite a shaking. When I opened the front door, I found what was left of her collection of crystal spread across the adobe tiles in her front room. Everything was off its moorings. Armchairs had jumped off their legs and rode the rug, low and useless. The china cabinet had been smashed face down like a knocked-out boxer. A framed portrait of the cockatoos, nearly 4 feet square, had slipped from its place on the wall and rested on a brocaded cushion in the middle of F's sofa. In the kitchen, the cupboards had opened and emptied their contents all over the floor. I would have laughed, but the mess was mine to deal with. Since F had given up her last and lay now washed and polished and wrapped, as the custom demands, at a suburban chapel. As I crunched and crackled across the wreckage toward the open front door, I saw a woman coming up the walk. A bright apron dropped over her shoulders was untied and flapped in the hot wind. Her grey hair had come unclipped, and it flew too, a fuzzy halo above her ears. I knew at once. This was the woman who had nursed my great-aunt in her final months. She was F's only friend, and possibly her lover, though this had never been said outright, and we hadn't felt comfortable asking. F had been unhappily married to a tyrant who wore high-rise slacks and wide ties that stopped at his breastbone. When her husband finally died, F and her friend had become inseparable, relying on each other for support and companionship as old age and the pressures of the city made life more and more difficult. My great-aunt F had been one of the first of our family to leave the old home in Europe. She was a pretty and vivacious blonde, a true Galician oddity, and she thrived like bluegrass in the New World air. I forget how she found her way to California, but her brassy superficiality, her unself-conscious acquisitiveness, had always seemed perfectly at home in the American West. She'd made a little income on the side by perfecting a distinctive con, in which she went into a store, pulled some piece of stock down on herself, and then cut a wicked settlement in lieu of a lawsuit. I'd never visited her in California, but she'd always joked on the phone about her good life there. Aunt F for phony, my dad used to whisper as he handed me the receiver. Say something nice, son. The doctors at the hospital where F died would not say whether it had been the quake that finished her off. They and the nurses as well kept asking, family or friend? I could have had our whole ancestral line with me in the rented car, an entire family tree plucked off the continents of the world and resurrected from the best and the worst ends, and I'm sure it wouldn't have been enough to tempt the hospital staff to admit that yes, the machine had unplugged as the earth shook, the bed had rolled across the room like an out-of-control chuck wagon, and they, nowhere near the scene, had been running, clutching their hair and screaming into the street as buildings ejected their roofs and cars bounced like toy balls. I decided not to press the issue. Dead was dead, and I wasn't about to sue the hospital corporation if I did uncover any negligence. That would only mean furthering my entanglement in F's affairs, and I wanted it all to be over as soon as possible. My great-aunt's friend, her nurse, her comforter, stood on the front step of F's house waving a recipe card at me. On the card was the phone number of F's son, an obscure number beginning, as phone numbers did in F's youth, with 2 letters, Fitzroy Western, 68557. The area code was unknown to me, but my informant explained Nebraska. The boy was in Nebraska. When I called later in the evening, carefully figuring out the time difference between the coast and the Midwest, the man who answered was obviously flabbergasted to learn that someone wanted to speak to my great-aunt's only child. The phone dropped, and he went off for what seemed like half an hour. Then a voice I recalled hearing once as a child, F had ordered her son to say hello to his cousin in Vancouver, came on the line, conveying an astonishing degree of fear, along with a hint of hostility. The first word F's son spoke was, "Mother?" I tried to put things straightforwardly, but we got nowhere. Before I'd finished a sentence, before I could explain that F was dead, my cousin launched into a haphazard narrative that had to do with a hospital, pine board, a warm coat for winter, government benefits, stovetypes, and UFOs. He was whirling off on a plot that included going down to South America to make tires with Ronald Reagan when he paused to ask if he might buy a cigarette off me for a dime. I finally hung up, exhausted. Though my cousin had thought at first that his mother was on the line, he'd asked for the cigarette in the muttering tone panhandlers use with strangers. The funeral was set for Thursday. The chapel had contacted a rabbi who agreed to officiate if he didn't have to give some trumped-up eulogy, as he put it, because he'd never set eyes on my great-aunt. The fellow at the chapel told me with a hint of embarrassment in his voice that he'd accepted these terms. He didn't expect many people to attend. I told him that this was all fine with me. After I'd checked on the funeral arrangements, I called F's lawyer and received an earful of legalistic niceties that did nothing to help me understand the terms of my great-aunt's will, so I arranged to visit him at his office. F's lawyer worked out of a pyramid-shaped building sheathed in glass that reflected the cars roaring by on the freeway. From there we drove in his soot-black BMW to view the two properties which, aside from my great-aunt's home, had been the sum of her worldly wealth. One of these was near the curious Gaudi-like towers a local character had built out of bits of metal and plaster and thousands of seashells. As we circled looking for F's property, the tips of these creations appeared over the rooftops of bungalows before us and behind us. One of the houses my great-aunt owned in Watts had been torn down by the city, an event that happened so rarely municipal councillors had been forced to invoke a law that originated in wartime. When she refused to maintain it and the heaps of garbage in the yard were condemned by health authorities as a breeding ground for bubonic plague. Interestingly enough, the house had been removed while the piles of rubbish, and one would imagine the plague, remained on site. We viewed the lot from the car, windows tightly closed, air conditioner whirring, and then fled like heartless tourists. F's second house stood proudly, spared by time and the shuttling of the earth's plates. It was covered in green shingles and resembled the little 1.5-story houses that had been built all over Vancouver between the wars. The house was worth something, the lawyer assured me, though he wouldn't say exactly how much, since we couldn't account for the economy or for the nearby neighborhoods, which had cooled after a recent gang truce, but might explode at the slightest notice. If, for example, the sister of one gang member wore makeup that offended the sister of an opposing gang member, bang, that would do it. He pointed at the graffiti scrawled on the siding beneath one of the house's windows, fat letters ingeniously shaded to give off a steely glint. "Cops will be interested in that," he said. "It's a cross-out. One guy sprays over another guy's tag. Next thing you know, one of them's dead." After our real estate viewing, the lawyer dropped me off at his office. I spread a city map on the front seat of my rented car and headed off in search of downtown LA, but somehow I kept driving past it. Bodegas and body shops wrapped around run-down corners, and the streets were full of sunburned stragglers. I never found Melrose or Westwood, and as I looked for Laurel Canyon Drive, Philip Marlowe territory, I found only roadsides directing me back toward Glendale. The motel F's lawyer had booked me into reminded me of a horror film I'd seen, where a man died of a head-crushing fall in the bathroom, brought low by a neatly placed bar of zest. I lay down in the dark on the wide concave bed as headlights swept across the window. Someone in the room above me alternated between a low moan and a smoker's hack. In the morning, I put on my dark suit and drove to the cemetery, leaving myself an extra hour to get lost. But the fellow at the chapel had given me excellent directions, and I found the huge parking lot still empty. I stood in the sunlight at the edge of the burial grounds, watching airplanes follow a neat, diagonal line across the sky. When the sun had risen to the very center of the sky and had heated the hills of graves and dry grass to the temperature of a sauna, the participants in our little service began to appear. A man I took to be the rabbi marched athletically up the path between the parking lot and the graveyard and introduced himself with a weightlifter's handshake. My great-aunt's friend got out of a taxi, and an elderly man said he was the chapel representative I'd spoken with earlier in the week. A few of the graveyard staff rounded out our group. We gathered by the grave and did the job, perfunctorily and without fanfare. The sun remained at its fierce zenith throughout. "Let's get it over with," the rabbi's eyes seemed to say, as he read the prayer for the dead. Only F's old companion cried, inconsolably at first, a sharp, unvarnished grief shaking her all the way through the service, and during most of the ride back to the street where her life and my great-aunt's had become entangled. I drove to the top of her long white driveway, and F's friend looked shocked when I said I would call her once the lawyer had sold off the property and calculated the amount she was to inherit. Her mind was on something else. The question she most wanted to ask was, wouldn't I like something from F's house? This idea sounded ridiculous to me, considering the smashed condition of everything inside it. F's friend told me that after my great-aunt had been hospitalized, she'd gone into the house and taken all the family photographs. These she had stored in her basement, where they had survived the quake undamaged. Would I like to have them? If I were a completely honest man, I would have said no, goodbye, they're yours, along with whatever else F set aside for you in her will. And for emphasis, I would have recounted an incident I often heard described when I was young, which took place on a Vancouver street one elm-colored autumn afternoon before F's migration south. She's running after her brother, trying to stop him before he can post a package to Poland. In the package is a money order that will buy their sister, along with her baby, my mother, ocean passage to Canada. It's 1935 or thereabouts, one of those nasty, ominous years. If F had gotten her hands on the mail that day, I probably wouldn't exist. But I relented and agreed to take the photos. My great-aunt's friend rushed inside her house, visibly relieved that somebody seemed to care about poor dead F. She came trudging across the grass with her offering and handed a dusty, battered box through the car window. "I didn't put them like this," she said, pushing her wild hair behind her ears. "They were in her basement. Until I found them, I thought the birds and me were her only family." After we parted, I drove with my box full of photographs back to the motel, where I packed up the underwear and socks and t-shirts I'd left lying around the room. On the TV, I watched an impeccably coiffed newswoman interview a liquor store owner who'd been burnt out of his business, and on the room's big front window, I followed a tiny, tailless lizard as it crept slowly up the outside of the glass. The collection of photos bristled by the door, a little forest of heads in hats, in wigs, in braids. I put the box on the bed and shuffled through its contents until I found a photo of my mother, whose infant face looked oddly serious, almost sad, among cousins I didn't recognize. Twice in her long life, F had considered that face and thought, "No, down you go to the bottom." I made room in my bag for the group portrait with my mother, setting the rest of my great-aunt's forest of silver faces back on the floor, where I forgot them behind the sagging bed. As I drove to the airport, I could think only of the birds, the two technicolored cockatoos that had found pride of place in F's home. Posed shoulder to shoulder in their portrait, like an old married couple, their beaks jauntily raised, they seemed to smile, as if they knew that above all else, they were beloved in Glendale.